Hosea chapter 4. Hosea chapter 4. And we continue this study of the minor prophets, and we've been talking about Hosea and this interesting kind of very lifelike or realistic kind of imagery of what God's relationship had become with Israel. Hosea has been told to go and take a wife of harlotry or adultery, and so Gomer becomes that picture of what Israel had become in their adulterated, broken covenant in relationship with God. And I think it's important for us to recognize that's an interesting word. We haven't talked about it a lot in this study, but the word adultery is about the covenant. Sometimes we confuse the words fornication and adultery. They're not the same. They're two different kinds of things. Fornication is a physical, illicit activity. Adultery is the breaking or breach of a covenant between two entities. You can adulterate just about anything in that sense then, right? There are times where even within Scripture other things are spoken of as having been adulterated. This simply means that what was once bound together or what was once in covenant relationship has been broken. And so what they have done here, though their behaviors probably included things like fornication and other illicit things, but the challenge God has with them and the use of the concept of adultery is a broken covenant. They were in covenant promised relationship with the Creator, and they were violating that relationship, adulterating, if you will, that relationship. Was Gomer doing physical illicit things? Yes. But the lesson learned is she had been adulterating or breaking the covenant with her husband. And that's the picture that we can appreciate here as it relates to her and Gomer, and as it relates to the people and the Creator. And so in chapter 4, God begins the process of letting them know the kinds of behaviors and challenges and things that they had done to break this covenant, to adulterate this relationship and covenant with them. And I want to pick up, we already talked about those things in the first 3 verses, but I want you to notice something in verse 4, something I missed Wednesday night that I want to come back to in our study in the book of Hosea. And so look at with me, if you would, at chapter 4, and we're going to look at verse 4 for a moment. He says, "Yet let no man strive, nor reprove another, for thy people are as they that strive with the priest." When judgment comes, the temptation would be to do what? To argue about who's worse, or whose fault it might be, or what's the cause of this, and you all over here, your behaviors are the reason why God's coming down hard on us, or you folks over here, if you hadn't done this or that. And so he says, don't strive with one another. It's all of you. It's the nation. There's no reason to strive amongst yourself or try to reprove another or try to correct things. I believe this imagery here in chapter 4. Chapter 3, he spoke of some hope, but that hope doesn't come till really whom? Till the time of Christ. So he does speak of it. Hosea does have some messianic prophecies in his conversation, but that hope was out in the distance. When he comes back here in chapter 4, he's talking about the condition of the people presently at that time and the consequences that were on the horizon. And there's no trying to debate or challenge it or figure out who's the root cause here and can we fix it. The judgment of God was on its way. And I think we'll see that more as we move forward. I want you to note with me in Deuteronomy chapter 17. He mentions here in Hosea, he mentions the priests. And he talks about how they had been striving against the priesthood. Now, it's interesting because their priesthood had been adulterated as well. They've got problems from top to bottom. But I want you to go back in Deuteronomy for a minute. Notice what broad responsibilities that the priests had. "If there arise a matter too hard for thee in judgment between blood and blood, between plea and plea, between stroke and stroke, being matters of controversy within thy gates, then shalt thou arise and get thee up into the place which the Lord God shall choose. Thou shalt come unto the priests, the Levites, and unto the judge that shall be in those days." So the priests would have, they're a collective, right? The priests are the Levites, or the Levitical tribe that the priests come from. And then within those priests, one might be the high priest serving on a particular time period. There might be other priests that are given certain responsibilities in very particular order. And so he says, you come to the Levites under the judge that will happen to be in responsibility in those days, and inquire, and they shall show thee the sentence of judgment. Thou shalt do according to the sentence which they of that place which the Lord shall choose shall show thee, and thou shalt observe to do according to all that they inform thee, according to the sentence of the law which they shall teach thee, and according to the judgment which they shall tell thee, thou shalt do. Thou shalt not decline from the sentence which they shall show thee to the right hand, nor to the left. And the man that will do presumptuously, and will not hearken unto the priest that standeth to minister there before the Lord thy God, or unto the judge, even that man shall die. And thou shalt put away the evil from Israel. And so from the very beginning of them as becoming a nation of people, even before they divide, before the divided kingdom, before God set in order that when they have disputes, challenges, difficulties, things they can't seem to resolve on their own, there was a process by which they could resolve those things. And basically they were to go to the priest. The priest would have somebody assigned in that particular time period in order to hear that case. And when the priest pronounced sentence upon that situation, it was what? It was final. If he said, go this way, don't go to the right, don't go to the left. You take the path, you take the sentence, you take the judgment of that priest. And any man who wouldn't basically had the condemnation of the law upon him. There in verse 12. They had rejected that concept. As a nation, they had rejected things that the priest, even when they might have had a quality priest here or there to go to, we're going to see that their priesthood was pretty flawed here in a few minutes. But from the very outset of things, as God begins to instruct His people how they would function, God said the priests are going to be the source by which you resolve conflict, and their judgments are going to be final. And He says, you've ignored them. Over your history, you've challenged their decision making. You've gone against the things. And so those of you who have striven against the priest, you've created more difficulty for Israel than you realized. We talked Wednesday about how this all occurs because of lack of knowledge. I wanted to back up to verse 4 because I hadn't talked about that. But we talked Wednesday night about their lack of knowledge and their rejection of knowledge as becoming a challenge for them. And then verse 7, as they were what? As their numbers increased, what else increased? The sin. And so as they got larger as a nation, as they increased in terms of numbers of people, all that seemed to do was just increase the amount of sin that was going on among the people. As they were increased, so they sinned against me. Therefore will I change their glory into shame. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, and I'm just trying to take you back to some of the early statements that God made unto the people as they're heading into the promised land and what He had intended for them, that He's now judging them because of. Notice verse 22 of Deuteronomy 10. Thy fathers went down into Egypt with 70 persons. You ever thought about that? You stop and consider that. How many is that, by the way? Not to insult your King James intelligence, but right, 70, right? 70, score being 20. So 70 people get down into Egypt. Approximately how many come out of Egypt when they come out of bondage? I've heard numbers as high as 2 million. Yeah. I mean, it's innumerable in some ways to be able to even fathom. From 70 people to a very large nation of people by the time they come out. They had literally been made like the stars of heaven for multitude, and that continued. And that northern kingdom had been growing and growing, but all that seemed to do, not increase their power and strength and have a mighty nation that was honoring Jehovah at every turn. It just seemed to only multiply the sins right along with the people. And so the challenges continue. As they increased, the sin increased. And because of that, I will change your glory, the benefit, the blessing, the help, the strength that I've been providing for you. I'm going to turn that glory into shame. Go ahead, Jim. Well, and we talked a little bit about that Wednesday, but I think it's true that if we refuse the information and knowledge that God has provided for us, it can only harm us. It will not be to our benefit to reject the knowledge of God. Yeah, and just like they had structure as to how to handle controversy that needed to resolve, Jesus in the New Testament gives us structure as well as His people of how it is that we can handle with 2 or 3 witnesses, and then if they won't hear the witnesses, then bring it before. So there's process and structure to how we can resolve controversy and difficulties among people as well. And then He even challenges people. Paul later challenges folks, why are you going to the worldly judge? Are there not wise men among you that could help you resolve your difficulties and problems? Why are we turning to the world to resolve problems among God's people? There should be people wise enough among us. And so they had structure, we have structure as it relates to that. Well, and that's, I think, evident and consequential, unfortunately, for the generations to follow. In fact, he describes them in verse 8 as they that eat up the sin of my people, and they set their heart on their iniquity. As best I can understand that, by the way, I think he's referring to the priests. The priest, you got the people on one side, and they began to just reject anything that the guidance that the priest might offer. And so the priests have one of 2 decisions. They can either continue to tell the people what God would want them to hear, or they can do what? Yeah, and appease the people, right? You can either continue to rebuke it, or you can join it. And it appears as if the priests now are just kind of part of it. They're eaten up with the sins of the people as well. Yeah, right. Yeah, it didn't take them long to start digressing away from what God would desire for His priesthood. If you go to Jeremiah chapter 50 and in verse 6, just to give you a picture of this, he said, my people have been lost sheep. Their shepherds, priests, those who should have been guiding them, their shepherds have caused them to go astray. They have turned them away on the mountains. They have gone from mountain to hill. They have forgotten their resting place. The leadership, the shepherds, those who should have been guiding them, were failing the people, and the consequences were coming down against all of them because of it. And they're eaten up. Their heart, they set their heart. They were determined that the iniquity would continue and the sinful behaviors would continue. And these are all parallel. Yeah, bad leadership can guide and put people in bad circumstances, and everybody's culpable. But at the end of the day, those shepherds, those leaders, those who guide, have an extra sense of responsibility of how it is they led people in the direction they sent them in. There shall be, verse 9, like people, like priests, and I will punish them for their ways and reward them for their doings. Basically what? When it comes to punishment, everybody's the same. Like people, like priests. They don't get any special privileges because they were the priesthood. They don't gain any special benefits. When I bring judgment, they turned their hearts to iniquity. The people turned their hearts to iniquity. Everybody gets judged the same. Everybody gets judged accordingly. That's what I see. I will reward them for their doings. The things and behaviors and choices they have been made, that's going to be the difficulties that will come to them. Verses 10 and 11 are pretty graphic, but he's trying to get them to appreciate that they were using any illicit means by which they chose to try to increase the power and strength of the nation. For they shall eat and not have enough. They shall commit whoredom and shall not increase. Right? In Genesis, God says, 2 shall become 1. But they had chosen to try to increase the numbers and power and strength of the nation by just breaching any and adulterating any covenant relationship they might. But they're going to continue to try to walk those paths. It won't bring the benefit. They'll eat, but they won't be full. They'll work to try to increase the nation, but it's not going to work because they have left off to take heed to the Lord. At the end of the day, they kept forgetting that there was one basic factor that would sustain them, bless them, and help them. And that was so long as they stayed in covenant relationship with God. The minute they decide to choose, there may be periods of time where it looks like they're okay and they're surviving it. There may even be times where it looks like prosperity is on the rise, but ultimately God says, I'll judge it. And when I do, all those things that you thought would bring increase and all those things that you thought were going to be of benefit to you, they'll all come to naught. Whoredom and wine and new wine take away the heart, he says in verse 11. The more prosperous, in some senses, they became, the further their heart went from God. We're warned about taking ease in Zion, right? We're warned about the ideas of becoming so comfortable in earthly things that we neglect to realize that no matter what state or condition we're in, we still need Jehovah. And they had forgotten that. And they had convinced themselves from the inside out that those behaviors and choices and the manner in which they were behaving and living was exactly what they should be doing because it seems to be working out for us. But judgment was coming. And difficulties because of judgment were rising as well. And then who would they ask help from? Well, we know it wasn't God, but what was it they were asking? Who were they asking? Who were they asking counsel from? Their idols. Their stocks. In King James, some translations probably use the word wood. Some translations use staff in that passage. The idea here is they were trusting and asking counsel at their stocks, at their wood, at their fashioned images, at their idols that they had built. At their stocks and their staff declareth unto them. For the spirit of whoredoms hath caused them to err, and they have gone a whoring from under their God. They think of the imagery of that. Who got them out of Egypt? God did. Who prospered them who took care of them as they came out of Egypt? God did. Who fed them while they were in the wilderness? God did. Who strengthened them as they crossed Jordan into Jericho? God did. Who let those walls fall in Jericho? God did. Let them conquest the land. God did, right? And here's the point. All of that was because of the work of God, and then after history comes and goes, and they kind of get comfortable in all the things God had given them, what's the thanks God gets for all that? None. None. In fact, they are the exact opposite. Rather than giving honor and praise and glory for what He had done for them, they actually decide, we're not so sure that's even the right God to honor, and they begin to fashion things out of wood and altars and idols and things that they would bow down to. And here's a piece of idolatry, by the way, we always have to remember. Why would anybody want to build an idol? I want you to think about that. I know that's a trapping question maybe in some ways, but I want you to think about it. Why would anybody want to make an idol? Okay.
It's like the Tower of Babel. That was an idol.
Yeah.
All paganism, all idolatry has its roots in the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that progress.
Okay. So there's a desire to communicate or connect with something other than themselves. So that's leg one, but I'll get you there eventually, and we'll see if you. Okay, something tangible, right? So now I've got something. God may be too abstract for somebody, right? Because I can't go and shake his hand. I can't have a direct conversation with him, and so let's build something that gives us something more tangible. There's still an element here I want to draw out of you. There you go, Pam. It's scary for you to think like me for a minute, but you just have to live with that for now. But what she said was, if you couldn't hear, was they could personalize it. They could decide what that idol was, what it looked like, how they prayed to it, how they worshiped it, how they thought about it. They get to decide that because the God they're reaching to isn't what? Isn't real. So He can't communicate anything back to them about how they should worship or how they should behave or how. So let's build an idol because we still have a desire to want to communicate to something bigger than ourselves. We want to believe that there's something other than us that we can reach out to. We want it to be tangible, and we want it to look like we want it to look like. We want it to be what we want it to be. Idolatry has not ceased, by the way. I agree with Brian. It has its roots in that moment at the Tower of Babel where they decide that they're going to reach into the heavens.
We always want something more. People always want another way of reaching God.
Yeah.
They always think, oh, we have to do something else.
Yeah.
And it becomes so adulterated that they move to another God.
Right, right. In their effort supposedly to reach the God, they actually create something completely different than what Jehovah actually is. They can personalize. And so God says, you've gone out from underneath me. You're not under me anymore. You've adulterated the covenants. You've broken those relationships because you've chosen some wood and staff in order to bow down to instead of Jehovah God. Go ahead, Randy.
All this refers back to verse 5 there. People are destroyed for lack
Yeah.
of knowledge. Because of reject knowledge, I will reject you. And then we've been reading the progression of rejection and leaving God down through these verses. And it gets worse.
Yeah.
Those who left God, they're searching for another God. They're building an idol, something you say tangible and personalized, and they've forgotten all about God Himself.
Yeah.
I'm going to reject you. I'm going to let you move. I'm going to let you go your
And I'm going to let you reap that. Yeah, and it's coming in the narrative here where God says basically that's the path you've chosen. Okay, here's what's going to be. The results are going to be yours because that's the way you've decided to follow. Yeah. Right. And if that one doesn't particularly match up to what I'm looking for, then do I just do what? Just build another one.
The ironic thing is that, with the exception of maybe some of the sorcerers in Egypt with the staff, these gods didn't really show signs. The
Yeah.
Jews always required a sign.
Yeah.
And the ironic thing is, Christ showed
Every sign there was. Yeah.
and they rejected him.
Yeah. Yeah. Every evidence to look to Jehovah, and they'd rather go to something that cannot prove itself at all. Yeah. It's still going on. Go ahead, Randy. I saw your hand. Yeah. 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 It wasn't. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah. Yeah, and when he calls him a heifer here in a little while, and I think that's probably a direct relationship to some of that kind of concept.
I will mention the group that does this, but in their book, they take the Ten Commandments and they take away the one about graven images.
Yeah.
And then they split the last commandment.
Yeah.
And that still happens.
Yeah. And men have not left that concept of adulterating and or removing the specific instructions that come from Jehovah. Go ahead, Zane. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And so we can create an idol and call it Jehovah. And it still hasn't changed the reality of the fact that it is not the God of Scripture, and it happens in so many different forms and variations. It's amazing sometimes. How people want, and again, it comes back for us, I think today, it comes just simply back to the idea that I want all the benefits that God can extend to me. I want to go to heaven. I want to feel comfortable in that eternal kind of conversation. But I don't want it in the biblical way. I want to create my own comfort zone by viewing God and His instructions through my own prism. Yeah, yeah. And you can't read the Bible and not appreciate that God has a tolerance level, and once it's breached, he won't withhold judgment forever. He'll withhold for a while to give people opportunity for repentance and change, and to change their purpose and direction in relationship to Him. But judgment ultimately comes, and the Bible is filled with example after example after example of how that occurs. And for anyone to read Scripture and argue otherwise or conclude otherwise is not reading the whole of the biblical narrative. It can be anything. Yeah, it can be anything. Yeah, yeah. The definition of spirituality has widely changed in the minds of people. Spirituality used to mean I'm seeking after Jehovah God. Spirituality now means I'm seeking after whatever gives me tranquility, and that's my spirituality. And it's sad, but a lot of people become very contented in that. I'm still reading up on that too, by the way. Any other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Randy. Yeah. 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 And Randy, with that, let me just add this thought. The challenge of this is so long as man exists, he will forever be created in what? In the image of God. And so there will always be within the very character and nature of man a concept of something other than himself. Yeah. Yeah. And so they're going to seek, and their options are Jehovah to their benefit or everything else. But I think you're right. There is something within the very nature of our created beings to want to seek something. The unfortunate nature of that is that many have decided that pleasure is their God, or entertainment is their God, or false religion is their God, or you just name it. We could just keep listing thing after thing after thing. Yeah, and I why the nature of man would do the things he does otherwise doesn't compute. Yeah. God. Yeah. Yeah. A core statement of Scripture. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah. 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 And it's amazing, Bob, and I'll try to tread lightly here a little bit, but I want to emphasize it because it's a detriment to them. But I mean, don't answer this out loud, but if you walked in this building and I was kneeling down to this wooden rostrum, what would you think? Right? You'd think I'd lost it, right? But if I fashioned it to be an image of something, or if I crafted it in some way to represent something, now all of a sudden what? Well, he's worshiping. And it's the same set of wood. It's the same material base. But the only difference is how I've chosen to personalize that idol, and that happens time and time and time and time again. Yeah. All right, good discussion. I appreciate all the thoughts. Go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry. Yeah. 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 They sacrifice, verse 13, upon the tops of the mountains, and burn incense upon the hills, under oaks and poplars and elms, because the shadow thereof is good. Therefore your daughters shall commit whoredom, and your spouses shall commit adultery. But here's interesting, verse 14. I will not punish your daughters when they commit whoredom, nor your spouses when they commit adultery, for themselves are separated with whores, and they sacrifice with harlots. Therefore the people that doth not understand shall fall. Why not punish them? Say it again, I'm sorry. Okay, so there's a universal problem here, and they're just kind of reaping. Yeah, and God will do that. When you punish, when I punished my children, I won't make you personalize it. I'll personalize it. My intent and purpose was to change what? Their behavior. God has reached a point with Israel where He no longer, He's done trying to change their behavior. He, over time, had time and time again, had done what He could to change their behavior. But He's reached a point now where they're just going to have to reap the whirlwind of their choices and decisions. They're just going to have to face the challenges that they've created for themselves. Let me share a couple of texts with you. Jeremiah chapter 10. Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 24. Jeremiah says, O Lord, correct me, but with judgment. Not in thine anger, lest thou bring me to nothing. Jeremiah recognizes that correction is necessary, and sometimes judgment is necessary. But he also recognizes if God lashes out in His anger, what's going to happen? It'll be consumed, right? And so Jeremiah recognizes that correction, punishment, is intended to reshape and mold the behaviors. God is saying to Israel, I'm done trying. Now you can be careful what you say about God in relationship with that. Let me say that first and foremost, that we don't want to be accusatory towards Jehovah. But the fact of the matter is, basically God's saying, okay, the consequences are on you now. I've tried to help. I've given you prophets. I've given you instruction. I've guided you, helped you, strengthened you, did everything I could to correct the path you're on. And even Jehovah God sometimes says, enough's enough. And you're going to have to accept, because ultimately they have to be held accountable. In Hebrews chapter 12, I'll give you a New Testament parallel thought. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 8. But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye illegitimate, right? Depending on the translation you're using, and not sons. If God doesn't punish, if God doesn't correct, if He has just turned you over, the implication of that is that no longer are you being treated as the children of God. That's exactly what's happening in Hosea. God is telling them, no longer am I going to instruct and teach and share with you and encourage you as the believers that you once were or should be. You're going to have to accept the consequences of the choices and behaviors. I'm not going to punish your daughters anymore. I'm not punishing your spouses anymore. I'm not bringing all that anymore. The consequences are coming. And they're going to have to face those challenges. Yeah, yeah. And reap whatever the results of that is. And ultimately it'll be Syrian and then Assyrian captivity. Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of where he's at here. Go ahead, Brian.
Jeremiah chapter 6:19. Hear, O earth, behold, I will bring evil upon this people, even the fruit of their thoughts.
Yeah.
Because they have not hearkened unto my words.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the concept of God allowing for the consequences to fall based on their behaviors is within not just Hosea's prophecy, but the prophecies of Jeremiah and others as well. The latter end of this chapter, who's he turn his attention to for a minute? Okay, kind of both, but he adds in who? I guess maybe that would be a better way to say it. He adds in Judah, okay? And his hope and longing is that Judah won't connect themselves to the difficulties and challenges that Israel is facing. You recall in chapter 1, we set the time frame, right? And the last of the kings that are mentioned among Judah in chapter 1, I believe in verse 1 of Hosea, was King Hezekiah. Hezekiah worked pretty hard to try to get the people back in relationship with Jehovah God. And so in this very time period in which Hosea is writing, there's a resurgence, a revival, if you will, of the southern kingdom, Judah, and their relationship with God. So he's challenging them. Let not Judah offend. Don't come to Gilgal. Don't go to Bethsaida, nor swear the Lord liveth. These locations, Gilgal, Bethaven. Bethaven was by Shiloh, by the way, Bethel, kind of up in that area, and we're running out of time to be able to share a lot of this with you. Now maybe I'll come back and do that real quick Wednesday night. But he's challenging Judah to make sure that they don't follow in this same path, and don't go connect yourself to all these places. If you recall what that was going to happen, well, I was kept stalling. I'll come back. I'm not even going to keep going. I'll come back Wednesday night, Lord willing. We'll finish up chapter 4 and move into chapter 5, Lord willing, on Wednesday.